And welcome back from lunch. We're going to kick off this next panel with Professor Lidson. Yes, we practiced that earlier today, so just to make sure that I got that right. And the panel's going to focus on direct-to-consumer testing. So Professor Lidson is at the University of Missouri School of Law, where she researches, writes, and teaches in the area of food and drug law, intellectual property, and admin law, which, by the way, is one of my favorite topics. Actually, it's not. So prior to joining academia, she spent 18 years practicing food and drug law, with 8 years as a partner at Covington Burling in Washington, D.C. And she is an elected member of the American Law Institute, has been named as the best lawyer in America in FDA law for 5 years in a row, and biotechnology law for 11 years in a row. So welcome.
So when I teach, I usually put a picture of a reindeer up on the first slide, and I say, rhymes with the reindeer, meaning Blitzen. But I've always been concerned that eventually that would fall flat with someone who hadn't grown up with the kind of the Western, the Rudolph song. And today was my first exposure to somebody who didn't make the Blitzen connection immediately. So I may have to come up with another approach. All right, so I'm actually going to work a little bit from notes here because I want to make sure that I stick to my 20 minutes exactly, and I'm going to screw this up immediately. There are 4 buttons. I have a 1 in 4 chance of getting the wrong one. All right, here we go. So what I am going to do is explain how the government regulates direct-to-consumer genetic testing. And this is sort of the overview here. What I'm going to show you is that FDA has struggled for years with how to regulate in vitro testing services, broadly speaking, and also with whether it even has the authority to regulate them. You're going to see that FDA has responded creatively to the direct-to-consumer genetic testing in particular, creating a framework that arguably responded to a lot of the concerns that had been raised about direct-to-consumer genetic testing. But I hope to persuade you of 2 points. The first one is that regulating these services is awkward at best, given the agency's traditional focus on tangible medical products. And second, that the framework itself is almost entirely beside the point, because consumers can get and interpret their own raw data or pay third parties to interpret it, who are outside of the FDA framework altogether. So while FDA is trying to be responsive to concerns and also trying to be relevant by regulating these companies like 23andMe, I hope to persuade you that actually the action is somewhere else. So let me start by describing how direct-to-consumer genetic testing services work. And many of you already know this, some of you run these companies, but just to make sure we're all on the same song sheet. The process typically starts when the company, that's the company there, offering the services, sends a sample collection kit to the consumer. All right, the consumer collects, this is the saliva, the spitting, collects the sample and sends it back to that company. The company sends the sample to a lab. It's another company, and that company determines the genetic sequence. Most of them are doing SNPs rather than whole genome. They send it back to the company that's offering the service, the raw data that is, and then that company uses its software to generate a report, which it sends back to the consumer. Okay, so that is the loop, if you will. The report might cover ancestry, it might cover individual traits or characteristics. I have wet earwax, for instance. Apparently I'm prone to curly hair. Some of us, I needed a test to tell me. It might cover genetic health risks, it might cover carrier status, any number of things. Now, just to look at the mechanics of the transaction, going back through it again, the consumer provides 2 things to the company. He or she provides saliva and money, all right? The company provides 2 things to the consumer: the kit in the first instance, that test tube, if you will, and also information, which I want to put there. All right. The device that it uses, in fact, I'll go back here, I'll take that out. The device that it sends actually comes from a third party, all right? Typically, by a third party, it will have a variety of services, and typically it has already undergone some kind of FDA pre-market clearance, that physical device that is sent to the consumer. Then it provides the information to the consumer. The consumer typically reads his or her results on the website of the company. It is possible to download reports as well. And there's another third party, there's another third party, which of course is that laboratory itself. That laboratory is subject to regulation by the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, under a statute called the Clinical Laboratory Improvements Act, or amendments rather, CLIA or CLIA, all right? The regulations under CLIA that apply to the laboratory, I'm going to try to hit to the laboratory, govern things like accuracy. They focus on testing procedures and quality control, and they're designed to ensure that the testing, that the analytical results are reproducible and consistent. All right. There don't have to be third parties. It is entirely possible for a single company actually to do all of this, to have the laboratory in-house and to make the kits in-house. But for purposes of this discussion, let's assume we're talking about three parties. All right. Now consider how FDA fits in. FDA's authority derives from a statute that was enacted in 1938. Why is that relevant in the New Deal? It's relevant because the world has changed a great deal, all right? We are in the information age, or perhaps we've moved past the information age and we're in the knowledge economy. The basic theory of FDA's roles and responsibilities and the basic structure of the statute that it uses, those things have not changed since 1938. FDA has jurisdiction over several types of product in the marketplace, tangible medical products and then other tangible items, drugs, devices, cosmetics, food, all right? These are tangible things. And its mission, as a general rule, is to ensure that they're safe and, if relevant to the type of product, to ensure that they are effective, and also to ensure that consumers are getting truthful, accurate information about them. All right. As a general rule, medical products, meaning drugs, devices, biological products, products that are part of medical intervention, are subject to pre-market authorization procedures of one sort or another. Medical devices in particular are subject to pre-market review based on, and the type of review they undergo depends on the kind of product they are, the risk that the product presents. The agency classifies medical devices into three classes based on the level of risk. Toothbrushes are at one end of the spectrum, pacemakers are at the other end of the spectrum, all right? The classification dictates the pre-market process that applies, as well as the types of authorities, the types of rules that apply to the product once it's on the market. In vitro diagnosis, whether it is, diagnosis in vitro in a lab, whether it relates to a urinalysis to confirm pregnancy, or a blood test for a CBC, or a genetic test. No matter what it is, in vitro diagnosis has always presented a little bit of a challenge given the framework that I have just described, all right? Some people refer to in vitro diagnostics as if there is a single thing that is an in vitro diagnostic, a tangible product like a pharmaceutical or a coronary stent. And when in vitro diagnosis has occurred, there are tangible items involved, right? The collection device, that's a tangible item that was involved in this in vitro diagnosis process, the cup for your urine, the tube for the saliva. The reagents that are used, those are tangible things that are used. Maybe a testing platform. The definition of medical device, which is what I have up here on the screen, has always been broad enough to capture those things: apparatus, contrivance, articles that are used in diagnosis. It will capture those things. The problem is that in vitro diagnosis itself is more of a service than a thing, all right? Why does FDA face challenges here? So the reason it faces challenges is devices that are subject to FDA jurisdiction. I should be by the microphone, I'm sorry. I pace when I do about a mile over the course of an hour in class. I need to try to stay right here. Devices that are subject to FDA jurisdiction, quite clearly, from the last slide, have to be tangible, all right? They don't have to touch patients. They don't have to be sold to consumers, but they do have to be concrete things in the real world, all right? Second, they have to be intended for use in the diagnosis of disease, all right? Disease or other conditions. The word conditions was added to the statute to capture things like pregnancy. It probably does not include curly hair. Does it include genetic health risk? I'm going to put a question mark on that, and I'm not going to come back to it, but there's a question mark there. All right. The third thing is FDA only has jurisdiction over these tangible items intended for use in diagnosis if they are shipped in interstate commerce, or for our purposes, let's just say there is a commercial transaction, all right? For all of these reasons, FDA has treaded very, very carefully with respect to in vitro diagnosis. So here is what it does. First of all, if a company makes a test kit that it sells on the open market to labs, that is, FDA will regulate that as a medical device. A kit might have a bunch of different reagents, for example. It will have a specific purpose for which it's intended, a specific test that you're supposed to perform with it, and it will have instructions about how to use the kit for that test. So in this situation, the company is selling a tangible item that is intended for use in diagnosis, and it is selling it on the open market to another company. All right. Second, if a company makes an analyte-specific reagent and sells it, ASR I'll say, and sells that to labs for use in diagnosis, FDA will regulate that as a medical device. And again, here again, you have a tangible item intended for use in diagnosis of disease, and you have the commercial transaction. Most ASRs are designated low risk. Think back to my 3 tiers. They're designated as low risk, and most of them do not have to go through any kind of pre-market clearance at FDA. But there are rules like the company can't make claims about clinical uses, and it can only sell them to certain types of labs. All right. Third, though, if a lab performs tests using reagents that it develops on its own, the agency has historically, traditionally not stepped in. So here, this is a situation where the lab gets a tissue sample, and then it uses the reagents that it has developed on its own and the test that it came up with on its own, and it spits out a report that it sends back to the physician that sent it the tissue sample, all right? That's called a laboratory-developed test. You'll hear the phrase LDT, laboratory-developed test. You'll also hear that referred to as a homebrew test, all right? In this situation, there isn't anything tangible that has been shipped in commerce that is intended for use in the diagnosis of anything in particular, all right? So the laboratory industry has historically argued that the agency, because of this, the agency doesn't have authority to regulate here. That has been the laboratory industry's position. FDA, not surprisingly, uses different words. It says it is exercising enforcement discretion, all right, which is code for we have authority here, we're just choosing not to use it at this time, all right? So that is a legal dispute, an unresolved legal dispute. All right. Now consider genetic testing. Here's my chart again. I'm simplifying it a little bit. So you've got one company that ships a tube for collecting saliva to the consumer. Another company made that tube and sold the tube to the first one, all right? FDA has already authorized that tube, all right? That has gone through an FDA process. Then A sends, and the tube, right. Then A sends the tube with the saliva to the lab. The lab is regulated by CMS under CLIA, all right? I told you about that already. It generates raw genetic data, of course. Now, if the lab uses ASRs, analyte-specific reagents, well, those have already been regulated by FDA. If it uses a test kit that it bought from somebody, that has been regulated by FDA. If it uses its own reagents, FDA doesn't step in. That's the LDT, and at least in theory, there's nothing for FDA to regulate. All right, then the lab sends the raw data back to A. It's sending data, which is pretty hard to shoehorn into that definition of medical device I showed you. Then the company uses its software. I can kind of dorky picture there, but it's using its software. At least it's not a floppy disk, to generate a report, all right, which it sends to the consumer. That report is also information, hard to shoehorn into the definition of medical device. So what can FDA do about company A? So that's the big regulatory question. That company is performing a service, right? To some extent, it's coordinating the process as a whole. It's serving as the consumer's single point of contact. There's a lot of other entities involved here. It is that consumer's single point of contact. And it's taking the function it performs ultimately is it's taking these raw data and it is comparing those raw data with publicly available information and generating a report. To make this concrete, so you guys are going to get lots of my genetic information here, and that's okay. This is what I did 23andMe back in the dark ages before it got the letter from FDA, so this is what the old reports looked like. All right, here's an example of what they sent me for, so it's with respect to one SNP, and they show you what your genotype is, and they tell you what it means, and then you've got your citation over here. All right, here's your genotype, here are the studies that relate to that genotype, and here's what those studies found. All right, so how can FDA assert authority here? It needs a tangible item, right? You know that. So starting in the 2000s, it zeroed in on the software. There's a tangible item we can regulate, all right? After all, it's a tangible item. It is sold in interstate commerce, presumably, and it is used in diagnosis. So FDA started writing to the labs, not the service companies, but it started by writing to the labs that were doing the homebrew stuff. And it's the ones that had their own reagents, that would get the tissue sample, use their own reagents, and then software, and then send it back to the doctor. They wrote to these labs, and they said, and this was kind of tentative, they wrote and they said, please come talk to us about the regulatory framework that might apply to you. But of course, if you're an entity that believes the FDA doesn't regulate you, if you get a please come talk to us letter, you're going to ignore it, right, or push back. And that is what happened. The companies pushed back, and then you had a lot of other entities also at that point raising questions. Wait a second, FDA doesn't have any authority here. All right. Then the companies providing DTC testing services, that area of commerce exploded, right? You saw the numbers on an earlier presentation today. The companies that are coordinating this direct-to-consumer process, that commercial space just blew up, all right? 2 administrations in a row got interested. So did the Federal Trade Commission, so did members of Congress. So in 2010, FDA finally wrote to the companies offering DTC testing services, these coordinators, and rather than saying, come talk to us, they said, we think you are in that highest risk class at the bottom, and those classes we like pacemakers. You need to file a pre-market approval application. So that's a full-blown application, like a new drug application. It's the most onerous type. They're required for high-risk devices. So at this point, 23andMe wades in. And instead of filing a pre-market approval application, they filed what's called a 510K notification. This is the type of submission that's appropriate for a moderate risk device. And what it does is it asks for permission to market a product on the basis of the product being similar to something that's been on the market before, all right? And you submit a comparison and you compare the product's intended use and its technological characteristics with those of another product on the market. There can be differences. Those are permitted as long as the differences don't raise safety and efficacy issues. FDA had wanted the full-blown pre-market approval application, not happy with this 510K. There's a lot of tense back and forth for a few years. By the middle of 2014, FDA and 23andMe had settled on a regulatory approach. All right, let me describe the approach. The plan is to use a third type of submission to FDA. It's called a de novo classification. It's in the statute. The idea behind a de novo classification is that even though a product, a device, is novel, never before seen, first of its kind, it is not a high-risk device. The way our statute is written, if it's novel, never before seen, it is just automatically default assumed to be high risk. This is appropriate if, despite the fact that it's never before been seen, it's not high risk, all right, like a pacemaker. And the theory is, if you pick de novo classification, the theory is, let me rephrase, de novo classification is appropriate if it is novel, but it is not high risk, all right? The request for de novo classification ends up being a very voluminous submission, all right? It can be similar to a PMA, pre-market approval application at the end of the day. It is whatever is necessary to persuade the agency that this thing they have never seen before is safe and effective, all right, and doesn't need PMAs the next time someone wants to do one. So it contains analytical data, it contains clinical data, and once the agency agrees, yes, you're right, I'm going to approve your de novo classification request, two things happen. The first is that the company that submitted the de novo classification gets to market their device. All right, they get to market their own product. The second thing that happens is that FDA gives that device type a generic name and then designates it as low risk or moderate risk, whichever is appropriate, subject to whatever controls, special conditions the agency thinks are necessary to ensure that everyone marketing these kinds of products is marketing something that's safe and effective. Once this is done, other companies that want to market this type of product don't have to go through the pre-market approval application. All right, they will file a 510K, that's the comparison submission, and show that they're similar to this other one of that type that's on the market. So for 23andMe and direct-to-consumer genetic tests, FDA seems to have decided on several different, distinct types of device. It has divided the genetic testing services offered by 23andMe into different categories, and each of one ends up being its own device type. The first one, this is October of 2015, where FDA approved a de novo classification request from the company for its personal genome service, if you will, for it's a carrier screening test. All right, this one happened to be Bloom syndrome. So when they are doing a personal genome service for screening for carrier status, this now is the type of device in question. This is the generic term for it. It is a autosomal recessive carrier screening gene mutation detective system. That's what it's called. It's got its own regulation. They have put it in that medium category. And this is the company's own product and what it is indicated for. All right, and it has special controls, which we'll talk about in a second, conditions that apply. So that's the first category. Then in 2017, we have the second category. This is a second type of device. And I don't have the underneath thing, but you can see I blocked it. It's a different number. That one is 5940, this one is 5950. All right, so it was a second de novo request, a second device type for the personal genome service to detect genetic health risks, all right? This particular device that had been the subject of the de novo classification has 10 indications. I just put 3 of them up here. You can see Parkinson's, late onset Alzheimer's, and again, the agency gave the device a generic name, and I blocked so you can't see it, a generic name and a regulation, and specified all the controls that would apply. Significantly here, the agency, here's more of the language here, should be classified in class 2, and here's the description of the device. Significantly, I've now given you the language from the regulation. The regulation says that there are 4 types of indication that are off the table for this device type. Meaning, in other words, if you have one of these types of indication, this isn't your device. It's a different device, okay? So, significantly here, if it's a prenatal testing, that's not this type of device, or if it is a testing for predisposition to a type of cancer where the results might lead to intervention, it's not this type of device. Then earlier this month, the third de novo classification came, all right? So this particular one, same type of service, but it is for one of the things that had been carved out last time for cancer risk assessment where the results might lead to an intervention. And this particular one, also still 23andMe, is 3 mutations of the BRCA genes. We don't have this paperwork yet from that because it was just cleared earlier this month. So 2 further notes about what FDA has done here. First of all, the special controls, the conditions that attach. In a lot of respects, they respond to a lot of the concerns that have been raised in the public policy literature, at least, about direct-to-consumer genetic testing services, all right? For instance, there are detailed requirements regarding what kind of clinical performance studies have to be done to clinically validate them ahead of time, and what kind of studies have to be done to ensure that the results of the testing are accurate and consistent. They have to say on their labeling for consumers that this isn't addressing your entire genetic health profile, your entire genetic profile rather, that environmental and lifestyle factors may be relevant or even more relevant to whether you actually develop a disease in question. There's also extensive labeling for healthcare professionals, and an opt-in approach for certain life-threatening diseases. So a lot of, not all of, but a lot of the issues that have been raised in the public policy literature, FDA tried to address through conditions attached on getting to market. The second thing that is relevant here that I don't have the slide for is that the agency has taken a pretty unusual approach to pre-market review here, all right? After placing the genetic health risk device, if you will, service, if you will, into the moderate risk class, it exempted the device from pre-market notification altogether, meaning no need to even file those 510K submissions. But that exemption only applies to that company once it has gone through the process once with its own device. So what that means is 23andMe can add indications to its personal genome service device that went through the de novo classification. But if somebody else wants to come, it can add indications, new diseases, without going through a pre-market notification process. But other companies that want to market that device type have to submit a 510K still for the first time through. Then they can add indications once they get cleared. It's not unusual for low-risk devices to be exempt from 510K altogether. That's fairly common, but typically FDA exempts by device type rather than by company. This sort of company-by-company approach to the exemptions, to me, that is emblematic of the fact that regulation here in the first instance is a little awkward because we are talking about companies offering services rather than things. I think that's the novel approach is part and parcel of having to grapple with a new kind of technology to regulate. So here's the punchline, all right? A consumer can download his or her raw data from the websites. FDA does not interfere with that. This is me. I did this, all right? The FDA acknowledges that consumers believe they own their raw data, the genetic code of their bodies, as long as the company is simply providing me with information about my genetic code. The agency has said we're not going to interfere. I would submit to you that they would have difficulty articulating a legal basis to interfere if the company is just providing me with a readout of my code. But imagine you get your data, all right, several 100,000 SNPs. I'm sure there's people in the audience now looking at that going, oh, she's going to die of. No, I'm just kidding. That's my stuff, all right? 600,000 lines of this is what I got. What do? Well, if you're highly motivated, technologically sophisticated, and have a lot of disposable time, and access to scientific publications that are behind paywalls, maybe you sit down and you look it all up, all right? Or maybe you hire a smart college student to do it for you. Enter Prometheus. All right, what is this? This company bills itself as a literature retrieval system. There are quite a few of these companies. It will take your raw data and build a report for you. And it's comparing your genotype with findings in SNPpedia, all right? And you get a very, very detailed report, covers hundreds of diseases. You click on a disease, and you will get 40 SNPs and a readout. So you get more of me, all right? Here is, I can't even see it. It's, okay, Leber's optic, it's right in front of me too. This is what I'm sorry. Atrophy, Leber's optic atrophy. And you can see what they did here for me, all right? And they give you bad, good, but that's just based on whether the scientific study says increased risk or decreased risk. This is interesting, the magnitude, but that's, again, they have an algorithm they're using for how much of a magnitude of an increase it is. And it covers hundreds of diseases and conditions as well as pharmacogenomic interactions. FDA's response, it's exhausting and exhaustive. Mine just on aneurysm, you click on, I get 20 reports just for Caucasians from Northern and Western Europe. And when I look at it, there's just as many bads and neutrals. That's the reds, the greens, the grays. What do you do with this? Not much. It's kind of entertaining, right? Not all that much more that I do with it. FDA's response, we're watching closely. What can FDA do here? Not much, all right? That's what I want to leave you with. I'm not ending here, but I want you to take that away. It could argue these companies are using software, which is a tangible item, obviously, to provide a diagnosis, but these companies could certainly phrase their reports carefully enough to create a serious question about FDA's authority here. Your college student might use pen and paper to give you the same information, after all. If somebody provided him with a tailored Excel template to write down what he finds for you, does that template become a tangible thing for use, intended for use in diagnosis? You can see the challenge here. All right, at some point the company is just providing research assistance rather than diagnosis, and the tangible items, to the extent there are any, aren't actually plausibly medical devices. So the tension that I suggested up front between tangible things FDA regulates and services that it doesn't is going to become insurmountable at some point. The agency, if it came after these companies, is also going to get a pretty substantial amount of backlash from consumers who think they own their own genetic data, and thank you very much, they can look it up, so why can't they pay somebody else to look it up for them? So how does all of this fit into population health? Last slide. What I would say is that FDA has created a novel framework for regulation of companies like 23andMe that provide genetic testing services. I think that the framework is going to prove to be almost entirely beside the point at the end of the day, because consumers can get their raw data and interpret the data themselves or pay somebody else to do the research. It connects to population health, I think, because we live in the age of the quantified self. People have been talking about how many of us have these smart devices, data trackers on our wrists, and so forth. We all believe we own our own data. And as we move further and further into this knowledge economy and the age of the quantified self, generating information about our bodies that we think we own, I think this information is going to find its way to the general population, regardless of FDA's attempts to interject itself wherever it arguably has a tangible thing that it can latch onto. So you think about all of the policy arguments that are raised about the widespread availability of direct-to-consumer genetic testing. You know, many of them relate to the impact on the consumer's behavior or on the consumer's state of mind. Might this prompt consumers to make healthy changes to their lifestyle? Might it empower them, or might it lead to bad decisions about lifestyle, or lead them to pressure their physicians for interventions for which there is not solid evidence-based research? Might it lead to emotional distress? These are, I think, or will people use these to make the big decisions? I think these are the right questions, but I don't think we should be asking them in order to inform whether and how the government should regulate direct-to-consumer genetic testing. I think we need to be asking these questions so that we can think about what other kinds of policies and steps the government and we as a society should be taking to ensure that when consumers get this information, the impact of that information has a positive impact on population health. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Litz. Thank you, Professor Litzen. I would like to now invite Dr. Blyle. And Dr. Blyle leads clinical services for Genome Medical, which is a nationwide network of physicians and genetic counselors that provide high-quality clinical genetic services to patients via technology-enabled telemedicine platforms. He also maintains an adjunct role in seeing patients in the cardiovascular genetics at the University of Utah, and has spent a great deal of time studying the genetic causes of birth defects, mapping next-generation sequencing data for identifying risk factors, etc. So, Dr. Blyle.
Great. Thanks. Hey, thanks everybody. That was a fantastic haircut, and I'll try and build on that. I am a medical geneticist. I think I was voted into this position because of the role I now play at a nationwide genetic service where we encounter some of these questions about direct-to-consumer testing, maybe a little others than others in the field, maybe more than when I was just practicing here at the University of Utah. So I want to build a little bit on what Erica said and set the stage a little bit. There's a few terms I want to clarify about direct-to-consumer testing, about direct-to-consumer data, and so forth. I want to talk about some of those impacts that Erica mentioned that we should be thinking about, and how the studies that have examined those. Then I think I want to step back and provide a little bit of a framework about genetic testing, because there is quite an array of different types of genetic testing, different resolutions, different risk values for that testing, and I think as a medical geneticist, I've been thinking about it a little differently, so I'm going to present that. And then I won't address what I think society should do, but I'm going to address what I think the medical community should do to start thinking about how we help our patients deal with this wave of technology. So a few things Erica said I'm going to repeat. The first one is something that I put this as a tenet, but I'm not so sure it's a tenet. I think it's something that a lot of people in this country hold true, though, that we have the right to our to self-knowledge, and our genome is included in that it's intrinsic to us, it doesn't change appreciably, and that we have the right to that data and to understand it to the greatest extent possible. So I think that's something that's quite widely held. I think there is, as we've heard today, quite a bit of value to the genome. There's obviously a lot of context that we also need to combine with that before we're going to be able to make use of it. But and that complexity does require assistance of experts. I think we are headed for a day when everyone will have their genetic data. Millions, I think the DTC market is approaching or already crossed 10 million now. And I think it's not a question of if, but when, and we have to be thinking about how to support that. We used to say the wave is coming. We're in a wave of genomic technology, and the cost of sequencing is continuing to drop dramatically, and our ability to interpret that through informatics solutions, and I'm gonna have trouble with this too, it looks like. Yep. Okay. It is exceeding our ability to share that information with our patients. So there's a growing gap between what we know as scientists and clinicians about the genome and what we're actually telling our patients. And the access to information, Erica painted a beautiful picture about the trials and travails of one company on this slide, essentially. But this is happening in a huge way across this country. And really, you know, from the left side of that line for testing that does not need to be ordered by a physician, just one company really, 23andMe, is providing direct-to-consumer medical genetic testing. Everyone else is still providing testing that's recreational and so forth. And then to the right of the line, all these other companies have launched into other areas of consumer genetics that I'd like to describe a little bit. But they range all the way from pharmacogenomics, carrier screening, up to whole genome sequencing, and can be had very easily with low friction and at low cost. I have the company Helix there, has a rather unique model where you can get your entire exome for $80, and then any interpretations you get are sequencing as service. So you pay for the sequencing interpretation step of that. So we'll come back to a little bit of this, but some of the terms I think need to be clarified. Direct consumer data, the step where Erica downloaded her data onto her computer for use, is not the same as testing. So having your data without any interpretation is not testing and is not regulatable in the same way. And there's another term that's coming around called consumer-directed testing. It's still physician-ordered, but it's patient-initiated. And a lot of those companies over here, like Color Genomics, is one that's gained quite a bit of notoriety doing cancer testing. That is ordered by a physician, but it's a low-friction process that you do online, and a physician reviews your medical history and okays the testing or does not. And a lot of these companies are taking that more patient-initiated, but physician-order testing. It's not quite the same as direct consumer testing because it does involve a physician and does involve a medical history. And then clearly I just want to reiterate that not all testing is medical, and ancestry testing and Venome to decide which wine is going to be your favorite wine, and those things are never going to be regulated, and nor should they be regulated. And last point here is not all testing is equal. So there's vast differences in the resolution, the analytic validity of some of these tests that are lower cost and that you can download. That they may not be as valid as the diagnostic test that you will obtain from your physician. So consumers are essentially getting their data 4 different ways that I can think of right now. Number one, the standard way where they go to the physician or counselor, talk about their history, and a physician orders that test for them. The second is a shade of that we're calling consumer-directed. Again, the patients are deciding what testing they want by themselves, either through marketing or concern about a family history or for some other reason. Then it's largely a lab-driven process at this point, and through collaboration with an independent physician, they can have that ordered in a low-friction way. Direct consumer testing has already been discussed. I think 23andMe is the main player doing health-related testing in that area. And then there's what I'm going to call direct-to-consumer data, or DIY genetic exploration, where you get the data yourself. You use that college student in the garage or Snipedia, and you can explore on your own. So, you know, another thing I just want some concepts to pull up here is I think there is some disparity in our access to our data. The data might be ours, but the interpretation is not ours right now, and really the access to that interpretation is not evenly distributed. So most of us are really familiar with this sort of health-related end, the classical disease-associated genetics, and even extending into proactive health now, where physicians are on board and we order that testing. And then the other end is non-health related, more entertainment value, 23andMe traits and the rest. But there's a kind of large gray area in the middle where it's really quite hard to get your data interpreted on these topics because physicians don't want to order them in general, and the FDA would probably step in and regulate them if they're health related. So I think there's a collision that we're experiencing somewhat. It's coming, it's already here. There's a lot of people with easy access, they have their data, this is going to grow. And we have considerable means to interpret that ourselves. And the medical community, on the other hand, has really moved fairly slowly to prepare for this, prepare the other physicians that are not geneticists or genetic counselors, and has had difficulty scaling that workforce. And I think that creates a mismatch where patients are going to be at risk for harm. They could have information that they're not really ready to handle. And I'm not going to put blame on one side or the other, but I think, coming from the medical perspective, I think it's incumbent on us to try and do our best to prevent that harm. And I think at the very least, we heard about some great stories this morning of missed opportunities in genetics, and I'll present a few more of those, where we're not maximizing people's ability to benefit from what we do know about our genomes, and I think there's an opportunity here as well. So, backing up a little, our community of clinical geneticists, we're a proud bunch. This, I think, summarizes in one slide our initial thoughts to direct-to-consumer testing. And why is that? Why are we so opposed to it? Genetic counselors to this, well, at least as of 2016, continue to have a pretty negative impression of direct-to-consumer genetic testing. You see that really more than half are very negative or negative, and a large chunk of neutral. Some clinics refuse to discuss with their patients direct-to-consumer genetic testing, largely citing the large backlog of typical genetics that they have to deal with and not having time for this. But another large set of them admit that while they think the genetic counseling would be helpful, they're really not prepared to handle direct-to-consumer genetic testing due to the subject matter. And then there's the concerns over the harms that we could be perpetrating, or at least perpetuating if we're participating in this. That's a lot of P's. So if you're a geneticist, you've seen this slide. This is always shown by Les Biesecker, a well-known geneticist who likes to talk about why are we so afraid. As a society of geneticists, we are unique in the medical field of being terrified of our own subject matter in a way. Like, you don't hear a lot of radiologists holding burning torches about the dangers of X-ray machines necessarily. Geneticists are fairly we've always raised concerns. We've always been the first ones to raise concerns about our own subject matter. And, the question is, are these concerns real? And what do we know about the harms of direct-to-consumer genetic testing or the other consumer genetics? And I'll try and go over that in the brief time I had. What are some of the risks that we have been concerned about, potential risks? I think one was stated quite well this morning by Rick when he talked about overpromising, or if it was Rick. I think people have high expectations when they go into these tests, and when they get a negative or they get confusing results, they're often disappointed. And we've long touted the promise of genomics, and it's not really made a big difference in many of our lives yet. And I think consumers understand that. And I don't think it does us any good to have companies who really tout the health value during a Super Bowl ad and then don't really follow it up with significant health value for them. So I think there's the risk that we're going to devalue genetics. Not necessarily a huge risk to the patient or consumer themselves, but a risk we should be aware of. I think some of the biggest risks, though, come with the possibility that patients will misunderstand and take inappropriate actions. That's been raised often. One would be underreacting to the results. You have a sort of a florid family history of cancer, but you get your 23andMe test and feel like, I've had my genetic test for cancer, I'm set, so I don't need to do my surveillance anymore. That's been often raised. Or overreacting the other way to a variant that could have risk if it's real, and taking inappropriate health care actions that may not be justified. And in backing up to the promethease, it's important for us as providers, at least, to know that the data that we download from these companies is not necessarily validated and is actually often got some false positives in there. And I don't think patients necessarily are savvy about that, although to its credit, Prometheus has taken some steps to try and inform about just how likely those variants are to be real or not. I think there's more that could be done from both sides, the testing company and companies like Prometheus, to make that more transparent. So let's look at some of, well, what about the benefits? I think the benefits should not be glossed over. I think that the direct-to-consumer industry has done a tremendous amount about raising awareness about genetics and creating just, this atmosphere that's been driving the community forward and pushing the boundaries. Certainly kept the FDA busy. I think it's also helping to drive down costs and can improve access. And we'll talk a little bit about access and the problems with access to traditional genetics in a minute. I think there's some cases where they can provide actual health value, and we'll look at some of the data there. There is a large gap, like I said, between what's known and what we're actually doing for patients, and perhaps more widespread sequencing could help that. Again, 10 million people tested is already dwarfing the All of Us study, which hasn't really even gotten off the ground yet. That brings us to research. I think, if you have 10,000 samples where you do know their ancestry, because of course that's part of the test, that does enable research, and 23andMe has capitalized on that as well. We can let Ken talk about that for ancestry. So just a few of the possible benefits. So let's talk about risks and benefits, but let's start with what I do in clinic, and this isn't necessarily me, but what about the genetics community and what about the risk benefits of genetic testing that we've been doing? So I won't talk too much about the benefits. I'm hoping that's clear to people that having a genetic expert is helpful in the process, but I think there are still risks of genetic testing in this field, and I don't know that we've necessarily eliminated those or handled them to the best of our abilities. So the first has been a problem with access to disease-related genetics. We haven't even begun to scratch the surface of preventative genetics yet. The access has been slow. We have not reacted enough to that. Costs have been very high. We have healthcare rather terrified that we'll continue to make those costs go higher if we do more testing. And really, MDs outside of genetics have plenty to do, and they've been very difficult to convince that maybe widespread education about genetics would be helpful to them. And this is in the face of some of what we've already heard. 60,000 genetic tests in thousands of labs. There's a couple surveys there. Internists in general, 87% feel that their knowledge about genetic testing is very to somewhat poor. And again, genetic experts, only about 2,500 medical geneticists and only about the same number of practicing counselors in the country. And that's growing, but it's probably not growing as fast as the problem. So what has that led to, the shortfall? Well, poor education about genetics often has been cited as a cause of overutilization or mistaken testing. So order rate for non-genetic providers is 3 times as high as for geneticists and genetic counselors, and about 30% of all genetic tests that are ordered are inappropriate or unnecessary. So there's some costs that seems like we could cut down. On the other hand, it's been inefficient. So if we go back just, some clinicians are still doing this where they're just testing BRCA 1 and 2, and counselors are practicing in the usual pre and post test face-to-face visits. And if we break those numbers down, just the punchline is about close to $50,000 for every individual that we identify with a BRCA 1 or 2 mutation. The payers are paying for that. That's what they want. They want to find those individuals with high risk. They're the ones that they're doing, but it's a pretty high cost, and we can cut that at least by tenfold. So a couple other quick points. Despite those high costs, we are not really penetrating the people who need to be penetrated in the best case scenarios. So here's breast and ovarian cancer, a recent paper, I think not shockingly to a lot of us, but maybe the actual number of only 20% of women who would meet criteria for NCCN guidelines have been tested over the last few years. So that results in a huge number of women who weren't tested. In fact, a large percentage of them never even had genetic testing discussed with them. And finally, having a physician involved doesn't necessarily reduce the risks. Another paper that reported that half of all patients with the VUS in the B1 or B2 underwent bilateral mastectomy due to a misunderstanding about just what a VUS means, or maybe that's shared somewhat by the patient. But really, a ways to go for the medical community. So what do we know about, I'm going to have to move kind of quickly, the impact of the consumer testing. And there is not a lot of studies on this. So I'm going to touch on just some of them. I wasn't trying to be exhaustive here. I think we already talked a little bit about the validity of the testing on that side. So let's talk just mostly about the impacts. What happens to patients who undergo this testing? Well, what is the comprehension? Are they misunderstanding the result? What is the psychological consequences? Is there a lot of anxiety that has oft been touted as a huge risk? And then are they changing their health behaviors? So I'm just cherry picking some studies here. On the comprehension side, the news is good and bad. Here is a study that is largely good of 1,030 patients who were shown hypothetical reports and were able to report 80% of the time the correct answer and had really high percentage of understanding on the statin response. Caveats, this was quite an educated audience, and this could be a different result if we did this in a different community. Psychological impact. This has been studied, and I picked this one because of the recent re-release, I should say, of BRCA testing from 23andMe. But, this is a tiny study, but 11 women and 14 men had results, really 0 reported extreme anxiety, 4 experienced transitory or moderate anxiety. Other studies in Alzheimer's have really not shown the degree of anxiety that we had predicted. Psychological, maybe this is on that topic. So typically not a high amount of anxiety. What about health behaviors? The news here is, as you might predict, not stellar. They do observe some health behaviors in the studies that have been seen. This is on diet and exercise. They did see changes in diet and exercise following genetic testing. However, they didn't correlate well with the genetic test results. So really not appreciable. Maybe just being involved in genetic testing is good for you. But and then what about inappropriate or appropriate health care? Again, back to that study of 11 women, 14 men with positive BRCA mutations. All consulted with healthcare providers. All but one, had the test repeated in a CLIA lab, typical lab, and so forth, and there was good cascade testing. So similar results. I'm going to move past this. And so I think these studies are preliminary, but let's let the data speak. I think really to date, relatively high comprehension, low impact, really modest, if any, effect on actual behaviors, but really low to neutral change on healthcare utilization. And as quoted by a well-known genetic counselor in the field, at least for now, the early studies of DTC testing have so far concluded that most of our concerns about patient anxiety, inaccurate test interpretation, etc., are mostly unfounded. Yes, I know we all have a story that suggests otherwise, but those are only stories for now. So on the heels of this work, the NSGC has updated their statement to a much more neutral statement. The AMP has also stepped towards approval of direct testing given certain criteria are met, and these are fairly predictable criteria. Our society, on the other hand, not so much. We're still very down the line. A professional should be involved in the process of ordering a genetic test with medical implications and laboratory results and delivering that test. So as a geneticist, I actually don't think that's totally true personally, but again, this is my 2 cents. I don't think genetic testing is quite so binary. It's not merely, it's recreational or it's medical, and all medical tests are the same. And so in trying to think through this, I tried to put forward a little framework to express what I mean there. I think that these different types of testing, both consumer and physician mediated, occur across a spectrum of use, with different motivations, either exploration about self to screening in healthy people to diagnostic and symptomatic or high-risk individuals, and that the risk associated with those tests also varies across the spectrum. Some are lower risk than others. There's also similar higher actionability in some of them. But I think the healthcare provider need is not uniform across that whole field. I don't think that it's a binary decision. And I think when a healthcare provider needs to be involved, they don't need to be involved in exactly the same model that we've always done at a 1-hour face-to-face visit to talk about all this. So, the caveat to all this, though, is if we're going to prevent harm and take the maximal amount of value from this, we need automation and education tools, because we don't have the workforce to handle this oncoming demand. So the green area is really to indicate where I think we could innovate to try and make this work better. So I'm going to skip to this last slide, and I'm going to skip my conclusions. So, my closing statement, and I think Eric summed it up, this is happening, so we need to come to peace with it, We can either stand back and let our patients kind of find their way through this, or we can step up and lean into this and try and make the maximal amount of value and the least amount of harm. And really try and meet our patients at their need, because they're not the same in all circumstances. I think there's a lot of opportunities to collaborate with industry. There's a lot of energy, there's a lot of effort there. I think there's opportunities to extend some of these benefits across different socioeconomic classes. And I think if we pick the right areas where there's the highest actionability, the best risk-benefit ratio, or where there's the highest risk of misadventure, that will be okay. And so I think, we have a lot of work to do, some ideas on how we might innovate in that area, but that's probably for another talk. So I'll go ahead and close there and pass the baton.
Thank you, Dr. Blau. Next, we have Dr. Ken Shaheen, who is the Executive Vice President and General Manager at Ancestry DNA. Prior to joining Ancestry, he has held several positions, including CEO of Avigen, which is a biotech company, and had also worked in the Department of Human Genetics at the UW. So, without further ado, Dr. Shaheen.
Great. Thank you for that introduction, primarily so you don't confuse me with Rick Kittles. He's not giving another talk. My role here today as sort of the head of the DNA group at Ancestry is really I want to give you some broad themes. I want to talk about some broad themes about where I think the industry is going, the way I think about the major themes that are influencing not just the business but the whole space, okay? What I want to make sure is, well, first thing, these are mine, so don't ascribe these to Ancestry. These are all my own thoughts. And I gave a talk, I was invited 2 years ago to give this talk, and I thought, wow, rather than actually just give you the numbers, why don't I actually update that slide that I gave 2 years ago, right? So, it was actually shocking to me. We started in 2012 is when I first joined Ancestry, launched the product. 2 years ago, we were at 1.4 million. We're over 7 million genomes right now in the database. We'll probably be at 10 million by the end of the second quarter, so call it by the end of June. We had a billing connection. I didn't have quite the chance to look at what the number is, but these are sort of, identity by descent matches, right? How people match each other in the database. It's growing nearly exponentially. It's not quite there. The consent went down, and one of the things that we really have worked very hard at is to make sure that there's more and more transparency from the standpoint of the consumer about what they're actually doing. So that went down. We didn't allow, for example, one person to consent on behalf of another person. So we've done a lot of stuff, and if you go to the site, you'll see that we're really working hard to make sure that we're leading in that area. So yeah, it's dropped the consent, but it doesn't bother us at all. We had 26 ethnic regions. That's how we started. We have over 325, and I'll share just a little bit about that. But the granularity and the power of genetics and the network has been astounding, right? Some of the things that we're doing today, I could have never guessed, right? 7 years ago, we could do, right? It was just, my brain literally could not consider what was possible at the time. And yeah, look, we've been talking to the FDA for a long time. I think Eric gave us a spectacular talk in terms of the framework, and we've been having conversations trying to understand, and we will get into the space. It's just a matter of when. So a couple big themes, right? We're really not talking about patients anymore. We're actually serving consumers, and that's a big change, right? It took, for the first year at Ancestry, I'd call everyone a patient, right? And I was like, I got to stop doing that, right? These aren't patients, these are customers, right? But it does shift your mindset in an important way, right? These are people that are coming here for genetic testing, not because they're sick or have a risk that they're trying to find out about. They're just coming to understand things about their genetics, right? And that's an important distinction. The other distinction is a lot of the healthcare models that we have they're driven by economics, and we've seen that today. Stephen just talked about the fact that only certain number of oh, do I need the microphone? Sorry. Are you guys having trouble hearing me back there? It's being recorded. Oh, because it's being recorded. Okay, let me see if I can actually stand back here. All right. I feel like a caged animal, so sorry about that. We saw Stephen was just talking about how many people that sort of qualify for testing under the guidelines today actually get tested, right? How many people that don't fit the guidelines that are at risk aren't getting tested, right? That's probably even a bigger number or substantial number, right? And so this is a slide I actually showed 2 years ago, so I haven't updated it, but I'm sure the theme is exactly the same. Take something like Tay-Sachs screening, right? Currently today you're looking at, well, if you have a Jewish background, then you qualify for the testing, et cetera. No, I'd rather be here. Thank you, though. You qualify for testing, and so what we said was, wow, this is pretty interesting. Let's look at the people that have some of the major mutations in Tay-Sachs, look at the ethnicity through our Ancestry algorithm, which is, pretty reasonable, and then find out how many people have are a carrier based on the ethnic background. And sure enough, the Jewish, particularly Ashkenazi Jewish background, ethnicity people had the highest percent of Tay-Sachs. But then if you do the reverse and you ask yourself, okay, if we take everyone that is a carrier for the same carrier for the same mutation in Tay-Sachs, how many of those have a Jewish background? And what you find is the vast majority don't, right? So what's happening is because of the economic models, and again, Stephen just said, right, the healthcare providers don't want to pay for a lot of false tests, right, tests that aren't positive. So what ends up happening is we use some of these, broad stratification techniques that we currently have so that we get more positives in the population that we test, but in fact, we're missing a huge amount of the people, right? So what we really need to do, and one of the things I think direct-to-consumer genomics can really do, is be a broad screen. If it's going to be $79 or whatever for you to get screened and find out that you're one of these positive people, I think that's a positive, right? And it can't be done in the current framework where there's reimbursement and the cost that's going around with that. So, can this happen? I think the answer is yes. I mean, DNA sequencing costs are going to zero. I was looking at data just the other day, right? I'm always thinking about, okay, what's going to happen in 5 or 10 years in this industry, right? What do I have to worry about that's going to be massively disruptive to my business, right? And one of them is that the cost is going down. So I'm looking at Illumina's price per gigabase over the last 7 years. They've dropped tenfold. Okay, just in the last 7 years. And if you start extrapolating where those costs are going to go, right, we're getting to a point where I can tell you, I think there'll come a day where direct-to-consumer companies are going to give you a DNA test for free and then charge you for other interpretation. Like, I think if I could give it away for free today, I would, right? Because what we really want to do is have almost like a Facebook model, right? You're in our ecosystem and we're giving you value. That would be way better than trying to charge you for a DNA test, right? So if you've seen the prices, they've gone down dramatically, right? We started at $129, we dropped it to $99, 23andMe, basically matched us. We've dropped to $79, now we have competitors that are at $69. This Prime Day, we sold at $55. We sold 1.5 million kits Friday to Monday of Black Friday to Cyber Monday, okay? That's the kind of, of scale that we're talking about. At the end of this year, we'll probably be able to process 200,000 samples a week, right? It's that kind of scale and economies of scale that are driving this price down. So I think this is a tenet that I hold in our business, and when I talk to our board, I go, just assume this is going to zero, right? Just assume that the price is going to go zero. The other thing is computation is going to zero. There was a talk earlier, I think actually, Rick, I think you may have mentioned computation in hospitals. All of this is going to zero. We were having a conversation the other day, and I'm looking at some of the numbers that some of these other providers are giving us as quotes. You know, we pay way too much in the healthcare system, right? We're used to paying rapacious prices for things that are just not worth that much, right? And when I come in with a direct-to-consumer hat, and I come in with $200 million worth of spend a year, all of a sudden, the conversation changes, right? And that's one of the things I think we really are going to provide to the industry, is we're basically breaking down this cost structure that we have today in genetic testing, right? So things that are costing, we make our own collection device, and we make it because the price of the collection device that was used for health or medical testing was just too high, right, for what we wanted to do. So we make our own. We have a manufacturing facility in Malaysia and another one in China, and we make our own, and we're getting it FDA cleared as well. But going back to computation, this cost is also going to zero, right? So it is about the interpretation, as Stephen just said. I think that's where this is all going. And so this is a graph. I didn't update it this year. My operational hat hopes that DNA testing is slowing down. But the first 5 years of data that I could get for use of the internet, people getting on the internet, and the first 5 years since I started at Ancestry, that's what it looks like. Okay, so I think, right, I tell my team, if there's a business that can argue that every human on the planet, right, should have this product, I think genetic testing is one of the few things that I think you could argue that every human on the planet should be tested, right? And this is a little scary, right, but this is kind of what we're seeing right now in terms of the growth, which, right, leads to the point that you were saying, Stephen, there wasn't enough time. I think, right, there's no way. Imagine if you had to consult with someone every time you logged onto the internet. Right, like it's just not going to be possible, right? We're going to have to let somehow, right, have a sort of web-based approach where people absolutely get the right information, right? No one's suggesting that we are reckless or careless about how we give information, but we're going to have to figure out a way that someone looks at a website, looks at the results, and understands the difference between a false positive, the false negative, you know, what a probability looks like. I think that is where this field has to go, and I think it's imperative. And I'll be honest, I think 23andMe is leading. We're doing a lot of stuff with Ancestry where the risk is low and it's still probabilistic, right? So how do people understand probabilistic data? But the reality is we have a long way to go, and if there's one thing I think we don't know is how to communicate with a consumer in a web interface and get them to understand the same type of information that you would if you were sitting with a physician or a genetic counselor. I think that's where the real opportunity is here. All right. Sorry, it's just checking for time. All right, this one, I don't mean to offend anyone, but I think at the end of the day, algorithms are going to be better than physicians and genetic counselors, right? I just think at the end of the day, we're moving to a big data world, right? The analogy I use all the time is, if you remember Yahoo, right? Yahoo used to be the best search engine, right? And it used to do something called, I almost said variant calling, but it's like variant calling, right? They'd index the web, right? And they say, okay, if you're searching for a cat, how many times does the word cat appear in this website? That must be the one you're looking for, right? And Google's like, yeah, that's not going to scale, right? Like, what are we going to do? Index the entire web? For how long are we going to do this, right? And first of all, you can game the system by putting the word cat 1 million times on a web page. That's not right. So what does Google say? Google says, okay, wait a minute. Let's leverage the power of the web, of the actual network. So if you're searching for cat, we'll see where you end up landing on a page. And if people who search for cat land on this page a lot, we're going to give that a high rank, and that's why they call it a page rank, right? And so that way it scales, right? Google doesn't index the web. It actually creates rules, but it actually lets our searches inform their search algorithm, right? That scales. That's where we have to go, right? We cannot be investigating the genome variant by variant. That's just not going to work. First of all, it's going to get way too complex. And second of all, I just don't think it's efficient and it's not going to scale, okay? So, you know, this is an interesting point, right? We talk to genetic counselors, and this is what people want to see, right? I think this is not going to exist much longer, certainly if we have anything to do with it, right? When I look at a family history and I look at genetic risks, this is what I look at. I look at every person, this was done with 700,000 people in the database, right? This is a genetic network analysis of everyone in the database, and Rick pointed out a lot about stratification and how do we stratify, and that race is a poor, proxy. It absolutely is, right? We've never used race ever on the website because it never made sense to us. We started to use ethnicity because we felt that was a better way to talk about it. And now the granularity that we're starting to see with this network effect has gotten to be so great that even ethnicity doesn't even make sense anymore. Literally, there are communities or clusters of individuals, right, that for one reason or another are tightly connected or tightly related. And that's where we really see the promise of stratification. So now it's not, are you Caucasian, are you African, but we're looking at clusters within those, really broad groups. This is a paper we published in Nature Communications last year. And let's see, there was, I can see why you guys struggled. Okay. Where's the, I was like making fun of you out there, but now I'm like, God, those guys, what is wrong with them? All right, so now I know. So, the very top one, I swear I tried that. I'm going to use the old-fashioned pointer. No, I messed it up. All right, here you go. So if you look at all those little dots, those are clusters of individuals that are more tightly related to each other than others, right? And what's interesting is, God, I really wish I had a pointer. Someone used it. Come on, who's the one that?
Very top button. It's got a little, it's round, and it's very, very, very top.
All right, I really shouldn't. I'm getting punished for making fun. Oh, the very top. No. That, okay. All right, so the ID, that made me feel way better. Thank you. All right, so this is what happens. This is what happens if you cluster all the people in our database, right? If you cluster everyone and then you say, so people cluster, there's tighter networks than other networks. Have you ever, anyone done the LinkedIn where you actually take your LinkedIn profile and have a visual representation of that profile? Anyone done that? It's actually kind of cool. It comes out as you would expect it if you think about it for a few minutes, right? Everyone in this room that's maybe connected through academic affiliation ends up being clustering because we all know each other and we're all part of our own network, right? You're probably not connected to the college buddies. In fact, I'm sure you're not connected to the college buddies I went to school with. So they're another network, right? And then I have people at Ancestry where a few of you may know some of the people, but they'll form another network, right? This is what we're doing here, right? We're just saying, how are people related? What surprised us was that within the United States, we're seeing clustering that we never anticipated, right? I mean, when I joined, right, the whole thing was, wow, can you actually even tell someone's subcontinental ethnicity? And now we're telling people migration patterns within the U.S. So look at a few of these, right? You can see that the Acadians here in Louisiana and in Canada are highly related, even though they're separated by thousands of miles, right? You can see sort of the Utah population here. You can look at New Mexico populations. Look at some really interesting ones. Look at Africans after the slave trade up and down the Mississippi, migration west. You can see the Great Migration north. All of this is interesting that we're seeing here. Some of the ones that our customers love is look at the migrations to the west. So we can actually tell you if your ancestors migrated through the Cumberland Gap in Tennessee, out west and ended up in, call it, Ohio, right? That's the kind of resolution we're getting. And when we apply some of this stuff and say, okay, this is great, that was awesome for Ancestry, but can we gather anything from the medical standpoint? Sure enough, right? Exactly as you'd expect, these people, because they're related and then they passed on and shared genes, right, have higher frequencies of certain alleles, and we're really working hard at doing this. So we think, again, stratification is key. How can you figure out whether a certain trait or condition or whatever is stratified in a certain population, but we don't look at it as black, white, Jewish, Asian, Latin. That to us makes no sense, right? We let the data cluster, network the way it does, and then we go back, and by the way, we have 90 million family trees, which is how we're able to actually put that data on a map. I should have mentioned that earlier, right? We do it agnostically. We have no idea who these clusters are. We overlay 90 million trees, look at their ancestors and where they came from, and that's how we're able to put those on a map. So this is where we see the world going, right? And this is why I go back, and I'm not trying to be, I'm not trying to offend anyone about algorithms being better, right? But that's not something you're going to be able to do in the office with a report, right? That's something that's going to require us to tell you, here's a network of 10, 20, 50 million people. Here's the variants as we see them. Here's how they're clustered. Here's the risk we see associated with this cluster. That's really where the world's going to go, right? And it may take us a while, but that's the vision I have. So I'm going to end the way I end with my team, because they also get overwhelmed. And I say, guys, look, we really are part of something absolutely great here, and we should stop and smell the roses. At the end of the day, it's not all negative, and enjoy the ride, albeit bumpy. There's a lot of things we don't know ahead. There are a lot of things we're going to have to resolve, whether it's FDA, how do we involve physicians, how do we communicate with the consumer. But I have to say, all in all, I think this is an amazing trend for really our society and our species, and it's something that we should figure out a way to embrace. We're very open to collaborating and understanding. We're having a collaboration here at the University of Utah. We have other collaborations that we're doing. But let's find a way to work together rather than try to be antagonistic, because I really do think the train has left the station, and at the end of the day, I really think this is very good for everyone. So with that, I'll thank you.
I'd like to invite all our speakers and also Dr. Van Reest to join us on the panel.
Yeah, I was going to say. You guys set me up beautifully. Thank you.
Yes, Angie, I know how that goes. Okay, so questions for our speakers? No questions. Microphones. Okay.
Alan Morris. Is this on?
Yeah.
Thank you. You can hear me. That was very interesting. I agree with the last speaker that algorithms are going to play a bigger role and have to. But I think we had a graphic illustration of why it's not likely that consumers are going to be able to interpret this in any meaningful way. I think the algorithms are going to have to return instructions, specific commands about what to do. Right, we had two people, at least, who couldn't manage the pointer. Now, you may think I'm joking, but those of you who know about short-term or working memory cognitive limitation know that the human working memory can handle about 4 constructs, plus or minus 1, before decisions become degraded. We're talking about, for ordinary physicians today dealing with a complex patient, we're talking about hundreds of variables. And we're talking about billions of potential combinations. Either your algorithm is going to tell me, take this drug because the risk-benefit ratio is favorable, and this is why, or you're going to leave it to people like me to make the decision, and there's going to be all kinds of unwarranted variation and inefficient care. So I wonder if you have any comments about that kind of use of an algorithm that goes well beyond just providing some kind of synthesis for a clinician to use in making her decision.
Yeah, look, I completely agree, and in fact, when we think about who our customer is, certainly in health, I think that actually physicians and genetic counselors are going to be one of those customers, right? There will be tools, and it may not be us who do it, but there are going to be tools where you're right, you're going to get the data back, and there's going to be a synthesis of that, right? And what that looks like, I don't know, and I think it's going to be a progression, right? Again, I'm really shooting for what's in the future. Is it 10, 20, 30 years from now? And we're going to progress, right? We're going to have genetic counselors and physicians are going to play an important role early on. I think eventually we're going to have, tools for physicians and genetic counselors. I think ultimately, if this scales the way it continues to scale, that might be a challenge. But yeah, it'll be a progression without question, right? I think.
Other questions? Okay.
Before we get to that, Sarah, would you like to relate that question to your experience with an algorithm and renal toxicity? I thought that was a great story.
Right, so we tried telling them what to do, and they said, no, thank you. And I think you're right. I think having instructions or having a plan would be great. And one of the things I was thinking about during this series of talks is that we're generating lots of genetic data, but knowing the accurate phenotype data to go along with that in order to give the right instruction, I think is going to be an enormous challenge that we shouldn't make it seem like it's easy. I'd love to stand up in front and say, we have fee codes, it's great, boom, boom, we found all these diseases, but all of that is predicated on somebody coming up with the right answers, as people move through their health care. People filling out the survey with accurate information. We were talking a little bit ago about how poorly people document whether they have sickle cell disease or sickle cell trait. And it turns out if people don't know that about themselves, if physicians can't get that right in patients' charts, and we have that kind of misclassification all over our databases, whether they're research databases or clinical databases that we then sort of reuse for a research tool in order to build those instructions, we're only as good as the data that we use. So we're going to have to get smart about figuring out who has actionable genotypes really fast.
More challenges. Okay.
Got it, technically challenged. So mine is more of a philosophical question, maybe again for everyone in the room, whoever wants to play, but especially for Steve and Ken. And that's about the interface between commercial companies and industry and academics. And I think there's a natural inclination to feel, at least from the academic side, well, they're companies and they're offering a service, but really the bottom line is to make money. And so, I see people nodding their heads already, right? So, and we know that's not necessarily true, but how do we overcome that, right? With Ken, with the 7 million, soon to be 10 million genomes available, that's an incredibly powerful resource that really can change the way we practice medicine. But we're all skeptical on this side that you're only going to use it to make money for yourself. And that is either a good thing or a bad thing. So how do we address that and how do we overcome that? And is it real from your perspective?
So I just got my daughter's tuition bill. You guys are in a for-profit industry. That's the first thing. So, yeah, and the way they worded it, to make it sound like they didn't increase the tuition means that you're also into marketing. So anyway, and we do the same thing. I can see our chief marketing officer already going to one of the universities. Anyway, no, look, being more realistically, I think we do spend, just to be clear, I don't have an answer, but we do spend an enormous amount of time internally thinking about what happens when, right, we're approaching 10 million this year, right? I mean, you could talk about 20, 30 million genomes. We're starting to collect a lot more phenotypic data. We've asked our customers, would you be willing to give us medical records if we asked? Like a shocking number would, right? And so, the one thing that I think the consumer databases do is that we get all the rights from the consumer. So a lot of the HIPAA restrictions, right, are overcome because we have one data set, we can link all those data together, which is great. And we spend a lot of time thinking, even if we're for profit and that's, our primary goal, we're not maximizing the value of this database. Right, just think of it that way, right? We know we can't possibly maximize the value of this database, so what we're thinking about is how do we open this database so that we can maximize the value, right? And maybe that's that we license it out, maybe it's that we offer it, and if something comes out of it, I have no idea. We're really thinking through that, but just realize that we don't always plan to be a closed system. We realize that's not right for society, but it's also not right for business, right? And so that's a struggle that we're trying to figure out right now.
I'll just add a few things from a different perspective. As a service provider that's a company, I think the incentives are very pure in a company that's driven by, you need to make the patient happy. They sign the checks. I mean, it's a service industry. If the patients don't have a good experience, if they're not getting good care, they go elsewhere. I think having been in academics, still maintaining an adjunct, I think the incentives in academics are much more complicated with needs for research grants and, I know the patients sign the checks and we put the patient first and always, but the complexity there is tenfold, I would say, and conflicts of interest, while they're managed, are just as commonly. So you can have it right on the surface, patient signs the checks, they come first, we need to make a margin eventually. Or academics, I think there's challenges in both, but, such is life.
Additional questions at the back. And while we're moving on to the next question for Professor Litzen. With regard to the regulation by the FDA, you commented that perhaps the fact that patients have access to their own data complicates these matters, in a sense that that's not something that the FDA can control. And it's also encouraging to see, I think, in the subsequent presentation that the actual risks seem to be lower, because in my mind those would have actually been higher in terms of what patients would be at risk for. So is there a right place that we can hit regulation-wise, or does the FDA need to regulate it more? Is there another agency that can cover the gap, if a gap exists?
So, I take some comfort in those data as well, and had seen some other studies that weren't on the slides. I think that FDA's role here, to be perfectly honest, is ultimately going to diminish. It should and will, I think, regulate the things that are being used, but the information gathering, algorithm running exercise, I think it just isn't a very comfortable fit with FDA. There are other federal agencies that would have a role. The Federal Trade Commission, for example, may have a role to play, for example, with respect to false advertising and unfair competition, and there may be a role there. The other thing I just want to add is not only are you straying into FDA regulation, but at some point you may be straying into practice of medicine issues. When I hear about algorithms, the other thing that makes me think about that's beyond the scope of this conference is what happens when we have AI starting to do diagnosis, telemedicine diagnosis for people, right? I mean, that's practice of medicine regulated by the states, but there's a gray area between AIs doing diagnosis and of people in front of them, and these sort of algorithm-run services that some of these companies might be providing. I mean, so the other government entity is the states that regulate practice of medicine. That may come into play at some point. Yeah, medical licensing boards, that sort of thing.
Okay. So I think we're almost out of time. Was there a question at the back? Yes.
Yeah, I have a quick question, maybe not quick. So I like Steve does, I treat a lot of patients with rare disease that probably likely have a genetic or a Mendelian disorder, and one of the biggest barriers for getting appropriate testing is the payers, and for a lot of the reasons that the prices are so overinflated. So I have this discussion with families. How would I advise the families if they ask me, well, can 23andMe or Ancestry.com offer help with this problem? So in other words, is there a commercial package for under $100 that may be able to assist my families?
So we allow you to download your data. You have ownership of the data. We are using an array-based genotyping system right now, so 600,000 plus SNPs. So I think, if you're really looking for rare mutations, I think you're unlikely to be able to probably find it in the array. But I think, and this is something we debate a lot, is it the next 3, 5, 7 years, we're going to have to get out of arrays, right? I mean, the array business isn't something that we did it because, and we're in it now because it's cheap. And it's affordable and it serves our purposes today, but there's no question, right? And when I look at NGS, that's absolutely where this entire field's going, and I think that's when basically getting your downloaded data and then you have potentially all those rare markers in there, that's where this gets really interesting. And we're pushing on that. We're trying to understand how do we drive down the price of NGS, and there are a couple, again, it's just like everything we see in healthcare, right? There's some pieces that are just crazy expensive for reasons that we don't understand, and we're actually, in the process of trying to drive that down. So it'll take a little while, but I think that's what I'm hoping to get to, and where I think your customer can then just take a test for $100 and download the data and then give it to you, right? Because according to Erica, and I agree, right, that seems to keep us out of sort of the FDA scrutiny, but allows you to get the value of that.
Okay, I've been told we have time for one more question. Is there a question at the back?
I'm Phyllis Nassy, and I work at the Huntsman Cancer Institute. Part of the reason why I'm here with precision medicine is because you have large populations in the rural and frontier areas, and in my particular case, American Indian and Alaska Native, who are not getting picked up here. And it became very obvious when you could see part of what was going on in the United States in the map. And then when you're putting it all together and throwing that out, it didn't show up at all. So how are you, because you're driving the industry, make it possible for participation of these populations that do not have the economic means to participate?
I'm sort of, that's a hard question. And the reason we tread carefully, right, is I don't want us to collect samples or give samples away, right, for free to certain populations and then have it seem that we're doing that to exploit that population, right? And so there have been opportunities, frankly, where it's come to me and we've had an opportunity to provide samples to a population where I have rejected it for fear of the backlash, right? So what we've been trying to do, and I paused that, is we really need to work with the community leaders, make sure that people understand, right, the objectives, the purpose, how the data are going to get used, so that, right, if there is sort of a backlash, right, we're partners in this, and that's where I worry about it, right? So I think, right now, that's been my single biggest hesitation.
I'm afraid that's all the time we have for this panel. I'd like to thank all the panelists and speakers.